Do you ever find yourself unable to focus, unable to make good decisions, getting super irritated or just overwhelmed really easily? And you're wondering, okay, my gosh, did I have too much coffee? Or maybe I'm really stressed out. Or I don't know, maybe I have ADHD. My next guest says that these symptoms can also be caused by having had a crappy childhood. Anna Runkle is the crappy childhood fairy. She is an expert on childhood post-traumatic stress disorder with 2 upcoming books published by Hay House and a massive following on YouTube. In this episode, we talk about some less obvious ways that a childhood can be kind of crappy and how a crappy childhood can affect you as an adult and some signs and symptoms of childhood post-traumatic stress disorder. We talk about why therapy might not be the right answer. We talk about exactly what dysregulation is and some really practical tools to get regulated and calm and therefore pretty much improve every aspect of your life. Even if you had a fantastic childhood, these tips on emotional regulation are really worth hearing. Here's Anna.
Ready to break up with your bullshit? I mean, all those excuses that are keeping you stuck. Because you have one life to live. And if you're not having fun yet, then that's a problem, dude. Welcome to Goals, Grit, and some woo-woo shit. The podcast where you learn about the habits of kicking ass at life. Whether you want to get ripped, get rich, or just get high on life, this is the place to be. Here's your host, best-selling author and feel-good expert, Una Duncan.
Hey there, Anna. How's it going?
Hi, Una.
Thank you so much for being on the show. Let's just dive into it. I would love to hear your story and how you became the crappy childhood fairy.
Well, so I grew up in Berkeley, California. I don't know if everyone's heard of it, but it was famous in the 60s for being like the home of crazy hippie stuff. The Summer of Love was just across the bay, and Berkeley was the home of free speech, and there were a lot of anti-war protests and things. And so a lot of the grown-ups at that time, when I was a tiny kid, were totally involved in this weird thing where their values morphed into this idea that they just needed to find themselves and they didn't have to stay married or keep watching their kids. And so I grew up in this like cohort of kids. My mom ended up turning our house into a commune. And people go, oh, well, that would be cool. But it's not always cool. It wasn't the cool kind. It was about drinking and drugs, really. And so there was, I don't know, a dozen people living in our house. And it was all about drugs and hard drugs, a lot of drinking, a lot of broken glass and things. So I had a lot of nice adults and a good grandmother, an okay dad. My parents split up. You know, they had the kind of relationship that alcoholic parents have. We had started out middle class and we ended up on welfare. We were very downwardly mobile. So my siblings and me had a rough go of it. And when I grew up, I was a fighter. I was somebody I got all A's in school, and I was careful to have big accomplishments. And, you know, that's a little bit of the downside sometimes of the oldest girl in an alcoholic family, is you feel like you have to like save the world. And so by the time I was 30, I was exhausted. Really before then, I was really like, I didn't really have any emotional support or financial support from my family. And I was working, and I was a creative person. I was a comedian. But in my especially romantic relationships, but really all relationships, my difficulty in connecting was starting to get the better of me. I couldn't really connect well. I was having more and more problems staying focused or self-aware in situations. Like things were sort of going downhill for me personally. And I had this very bad year. My mother died. It was really like a bad 2 weeks. My mother died. I had my heart broken, and I got attacked on the street violently, kicked in the head and face.
In the same 2 weeks?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah, all at once. I call it a trauma storm. It's funny how they come in threes like that sometimes or more. And so it was a really hard thing going on in my life. And it was the assault that gave me PTSD. And PTSD, regular PTSD, that's like the kind that comes from an acute episode, like getting attacked on the street. But sometimes if you had childhood trauma, which I totally did, I had contained it up to that point, but boy, the genie gets out of the bottle sometimes when a bad thing happens. in adulthood. So that's what happened. The head injury, it didn't look like anything on an MRI, but boy, I couldn't read. I couldn't dial a phone. I would just like burst into tears all the time. I was a wreck. I was going to therapy 3 times a week. I was telling the therapist what was going on, and she'd go, well, I think you just need to talk more about what happened. But here's the funny thing. When I talked more about it, I felt worse. And then I got worse. I was getting worse and worse. So this whole first 30 years of my life is a story of things getting worse all the time.
And sorry, Anna, can I just interject for a second? The inability to write and all that, that was not because of physical impact to your head. It was because the injury unlodged something that had to do with your childhood. Am I getting this right?
Yeah, well, it was, what we know now is it was neurological dysregulation. And it's a really common symptom for people who were traumatized as kids. Everybody gets dysregulated sometimes. And the feeling of it, there's some aspects of it you can feel and some you can't feel, but they're there. But your whole nervous system, it's sort of like out of sync. It's not quite, it's glitching a little bit. So your heart rate and your breathing are not going together. There's sort of this, raggedness to your vital signs even. Your brain waves, which normally would be visualized like this, flowing like water, they're not together. And what that feels like when it's going on is you feel uncoordinated. Your handwriting might change. You feel discombobulated. You feel suddenly very emotional or just totally flat. Like just things are not even like they are meant to be. They're going up and down. And in a dysregulated state, most of us will end up doing things, losing our temper, making an impulsive choice, eating the thing you said you weren't going to eat, or sleeping with the person you said you didn't want to talk to anymore. So these weird decisions come out, and people on the outside are like, well, I guess you just want to self-destruct, but you don't. It's that your nervous system sort of like has this little collapse inside under stress. And that's a really normal symptom after childhood trauma. And they didn't know that until recently. And researchers have found it now, but it's not very well integrated in the mental health systems. So not everybody knows that's what's going on.
So you were going to therapy and they kept encouraging you to process and talk about what happened to you as a child. Is that right?
Yeah. And talk about the assault and talk about what I was so upset about. So the funny thing about dysregulation is that for a lot of people, talking about trauma, it turns out, can activate dysregulation. So the opposite of what, everything that we were told to do, like go talk to somebody, get some professional help. If they're using just conventional talk therapy, it could be making the problem worse. So I used to go talk to the therapist, and then I would just get so worked up in the session, and I'd go out and sit in my car. I couldn't even drive the car for 45 minutes. I'd just be crying. My hands were shaking, could hardly turn the doorknob. And I'd say, I don't know, this doesn't feel like it's getting better. And they go, well, you have to, it's going to get worse before it gets better. You're really working through some deep stuff. But in retrospect, I can say I wasn't working through anything. I was just digging stuff up and then trying to get out of it all week. And then I'd show up in good faith again, hopeful we're going to work on this. So now we know there's a reason why so many people don't benefit from that who have been traumatized. And so when there's these two kinds of PTSD, right? There's the kind that acute, like, and we think of that with like soldiers coming back from combat, or it could be somebody who lived through an earthquake or an accident. Complex PTSD comes from ongoing chronic exposure to an intense stressor. So that could be like living in a war zone or a dangerous neighborhood or with an abusive parent or chronically neglected. And neglect has been kind of overlooked as a traumatizing force. It's very powerful for altering your nervous system. Because when we're little, we're meant to be, connecting with our parents, looking in the eyes and imitating. And if you're neglected, if you're just laying there and nobody's responding to your cries, there's a neurological development that gets sort of held back.
Mm-hmm. I was going to ask you if you could define a crappy childhood and what were some examples that might seem less obvious to us.
When people say everybody's traumatized, I disagree. That's what we call small t trauma. So obviously sexual abuse, physical abuse, clearly are traumatic experiences. Parents who have an addiction or an obsession or died or left, to be abandoned by a parent like that is a trauma. And then parents who are mentally ill, alcoholic, addicted, where you never know who you're going to get when you walk home from school, or if they're going to be there and it's uneven and their reality is all over the place. And then I talk to so many people who had a traumatic childhood, so I see these patterns. There's a form of trauma that really seems to do a lot of harm around people's ability to form relationships. I mean, all trauma does, but where parents can't really see the child as a real person. They don't really recognize the personhood of the child. And they're just like, oh, stop crying, go over there. And they're not like, oh, you like to play with clay. Let's get you some clay. Or, I know what calms you down. It's when we sit together and read a story. Let's do that right now. So that need is just not met very consistently.
So that could even be just workaholic parents who are constantly distracted or, working against poverty. I mean,
yeah, poverty can be a trauma, but it isn't inherently a trauma. I've met people who grew up in extremely poor circumstances in the developing world. And if their family is cohesive and supportive of the kids, even though they're poor and that's hard, there's that neurological damage doesn't get done of like, you're not even a person. You better take what you can get when you get into a relationship. You can have an intact spirit. So it doesn't have to be a trauma. Of course, if there's not enough food and there's danger, those are so many of the things that go with it. And the shame and getting bullied at school and being treated as weird or different. A lot of people are traumatized by that. It's not just parents.
Well, that's a good distinction.
There's a lot of ways kids can be different.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good distinction. So let's bring it back to you. So you're going to therapy, finding it very ineffective. And the what you described of sitting in the car, just a shell after having dug up all of this stuff and then kind of recovering from that all week and then doing it again. I mean, I'm sure that there's so many people who can relate to that story. So what got you out of that and how did you become the crappy childhood fairy? How did you realize there was a better way?
Well, it's been about 30 years this month since the night that this happened, but things came to a head for me and I was really hopeless. I didn't think I could keep going, And it was so bad I didn't want to tell the therapist. I was afraid she'd lock me up. I just thought, well, if I'm going to do it, I better not tell her I'm going to do it. But I told a friend, I barely knew this woman. I was giving her a ride somewhere. And I decided, I don't know why, I decided to tell her and trust her. And I just said, I think I can't go on. I have a plan. And she said, oh, yeah, I know about that. I know that feeling. Do you want to come in and have tea? And she acted like she had heard it 100 times. Which she had, because she was a sober alcoholic who had lived on the streets as a young person. And I went in and talked to her, and we ended up staying up all night. And she was sort of confused because most of the people she had ever met who had my caliber of problems were drinkers, and that wasn't really my thing. I was just, I acted like it. I couldn't handle daily life anymore and was pushing everybody away. And she showed me some techniques that she used as part of her sobriety program. And it was about writing fearful and resentful thoughts on paper. Very specific technique. Whenever I say this, I just want to say that if you just go write a bunch of stuff that you're upset about, it's not going to make you feel better. It's a specific technique to find relief from it. And I teach it for free, and I'll definitely leave everybody with the link to that. I call it the daily practice now. But it's a technique to write the distressing thoughts and then follow it with meditation to rest. And in the 30 years since I learned this, there's so much science to support what happened to me, which was like instant breakthrough. Not for every problem in my life, of course, but this dysregulated, terrible depression that had me feeling so hopeless and like I just couldn't read, I could barely cross a street. I was just so freaked out. I calmed right down. And I didn't have the words for it then. I don't think anybody then. I was dysregulated. I had complex PTSD and I was dysregulated, and it doesn't show on a CAT scan. But it was my brain was really not working, and everything I was doing, I went to the doctor, I would go to the therapist, and then that wasn't getting better. So then they wanted to medicate me, and I briefly tried medication, anti-anxiety, antidepressants. And luckily this woman came along and just was like, hold on, before you do that, try this. And I'm so glad I didn't go down that route because it doesn't really treat the underlying problem. And for a lot of people, it doesn't have any beneficial effects at all. if trauma is the problem. And so I learned something that just brought my mind back into regulation. And I was sad. My mother had just died. I had lost the love of my life. You know, some stuff had happened, but I was normal sad, not like breaking sad. And it was a very exciting time in my life when everything else began. You can really work on your problems once you have a way to regulate your mind. So I didn't have a word for it then. I just knew it felt great. And I immediately, people would notice in me, they're like, what happened? You're so different. And I go, I'll show you this thing. So I was like this annoying person who always wanted to show everybody what this was. And it was just bringing all this great stuff into my life. And within a few years, within just like a year, I was accepted to this prestigious grad school. That never would have been possible before. And I was hiking, I was running, I quit smoking, like all this good stuff happened. No drugs, just learning to self-regulate. And of course, I just want to put in a plug for physical exercise. Like no one in the 11 therapists I had seen in that time ever suggested this. And it's the first thing that helps is go outside and move. That's always what I tell people. First, go outside, move your body. And if you can move it with other people, great. If you can move it in nature, great. If you could take a walk with a friend in nature, it's the trifecta of wonder. You know, it just really helps. And
I'm so in alignment
the second
with you
thing
on
was
this.
diet.
Yep. Go ahead, please.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very strong factor. There's science behind it. This is not speculation. And so yeah, there's things you can do short of paying somebody once a week for 50 minutes to hear you talk about the terrible stuff. That's part of healing at some point, but so much of the healing is really like a day by day way of supporting yourself to be okay through life's ups and downs and choices and having to earn a living and deal with people. It's just a day by day, hour by hour process. So you need tools that you can use anytime. So this writing and meditation, I was told, do this twice a day. She told me, call me and read to me what you wrote when you're ready. And so I did that. And the change was dramatic. It took a long time for me to heal some of the other problems in my life, definitely around like who I chose for a partner. And I did heal on that, but it was slower. But I could never have even begun to do that when I was just frantic and desperate and hopeless. That's not a good, mix for meeting the one.
But yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I'm laughing at myself, not at other people. I have great sympathy. It's a really hard predicament. And in a traumatized place, where your red flag detector is switched off by your brain, it's not your fault. You can end up with some pretty crummy people. And I know, and I couldn't understand why I kept doing it. But gradually I was reading, I was learning. I got into the 12-step program for families of alcoholics, which was really helpful. It was like a really stabilizing thing. There was always a place for me to go. And I had the opportunity to help other women. So I think I sponsored about 300 women over the years. And what happened was, as I started to learn the science of trauma, it's kind of an outside issue in 12-step, but I would sort of say, I realized what it is with me. It's not just that my mom drank. It's in here, and it's trauma. I now know. And people I couldn't open my mouth at a meeting without 3 people asking me to sponsor them. And while it's flattering, I couldn't possibly manage it. I was spending 20 hours a week, trying to support other people. So I said, I know, I'll make a video on how to do these techniques. So I made a video, and then I made a website that you could put it on. And that was a blog. And I put a couple articles. And every few months I'd put a little something else up there. And so if people ask me, I go, well, go look at this video. And if you're still interested, give me a call. Most people wouldn't call, by the way. Once they saw what it was, they're like, I have to do stuff. It's like, yeah. Right. But that's what I do. And so the blog, it's slowly kind of chugged along. But one day I looked over, I had to put a couple videos on there about how to do this. And I hadn't really checked, and I went over to YouTube to upload another video, and I had like 2,000 subscribers. And I was like, what? Because my blog had maybe like 50, it wasn't really anything. It was just for friends. And that was in like January 2019 that I realized this could help a lot of people. And a year after that came the pandemic. And so it was the fall of 2016, I started the blog. 2019, I really got going on YouTube, but it was really just a side thing. I was running a company and I didn't have much time for this, but I was trying to just control how much time I was giving away. And then when everything went into lockdown, I was a producer of videos. I had a video production company and that all, we couldn't do anything. So I was like, great, I'm going to just make a bunch of videos at home. Did it on my laptop, recording on QuickTime, just made some videos. And that's really when Crappy Childhood Fairy was born and found its audience on there. I've always loved YouTube because I don't think anybody ever would have hired me to be Crappy Childhood Fairy. I hired myself. And I just started saying what I know and sharing my experience. And you learn so much from the comments and the way people engage. And I learned they're not really interested in some things that I'm interested in, and they're really interested in certain things. And that sort of shaped where I went with it.
For sure. So now you've helped how many thousands of people?
Oh, gosh. It's hard to say because what are we counting? Over 1 million, certainly. It's hard to count, but a lot of people come in. I have a free course where I teach the techniques, and that's always free. And then I do Zoom calls every 2 weeks, and my team leads Zoom calls. And we have peer-led Zoom calls for peer-led daily practice for members. I have a membership and courses and webinars and retreats and live workshops. And now I have a book coming out this fall and another one the next fall from Hay House.
Wow.
So the first book is called Re-Regulated.
Great. Okay. Well, that's what I wanted to ask you about. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about what dysregulation can look like if anyone's starting to be like, wait a second, that kind of sounds like me. Because, it's interesting because, you mentioned relationships. I can absolutely see why a crappy childhood would lead to trouble in relationships and maybe picking the right person. And, things like confidence and whatever. But I think you even said this can impact your finances. I mean, there's ways that this can impact you that you maybe wouldn't imagine.
When you have a tendency to get emotionally dysregulated, and also dysregulation can dysregulate your emotions. It can dysregulate your ability to focus and your ability to get work done. And I think a lot of people who are traumatized, and not just people, everything that traumatized people get is experienced by all people sometimes. But I think trauma amplifies it and can make it harder to come back from. Everybody gets dysregulated. And, you could just think of like a newborn baby when they just are like, and they get rigid and they turn red. They're dysregulated. And what's beautiful about regulation is you can get regulated on someone else's body who is regulated. And that's why, touch is so appealing. And that's why a mother's love is so healing. That's why. And so a little baby will come through the touch and feeding to calm down, and then comes out with, just alert and smiling and engaging again. And so I remember having my own babies and watching that and going, I feel like that. And then I feel like that. What is that? How do we do that as adults? And that's what it is. That's what these techniques are. They help you come back into regulation. And in a regulated state, you can connect. I think connecting with people is very much an invisible thing done by our nervous systems with other people's nervous systems. That's my theory. It's almost like a great big organism. And so when somebody's sitting there going, when you say, are you mad? And they're like, I'm not mad. Why are you saying that? You can point to the body language, but a lot of what you're feeling is nervous system. And I don't know if it's pheromones or, nonverbal cues, but you can feel when somebody is angry. You can. And then, of course, if you're traumatized by a raging parent, you might see anger where there is no anger. And if you've been neglected by a neglectful parent, you will see love where there is no love. And that's where you get a lot of this limerent obsession with unavailable people. And it's really common for people who were neglected as kids, really common. And it hasn't been well understood. And people just go, well, why don't you just pick nice people to fall in love with? And I was like, well, I would if I could. I just can't tell the difference. And I don't know why. But there's like there's a developmental delay. I'll just call it that. It just hasn't developed yet, that discernment of like, how do I read that somebody sincerely is into me or is not, or is just using me? And it's just not developed there. And so like many things in our brain and nervous system, much healing is possible. I can't really predict, like for any one person, is everything healable? I don't know. A lot of it is neuroplasticity. Some of it, I think in metaphors, some of it might be like diabetes, where you take care of the problem and you do your techniques every day, and you can reverse the symptoms of diabetes. But if you just give up on your habits, it'll come right back. It could be worse this time. That's my experience. Some injuries from trauma are more like an amputation. You're not going to get your leg back, so to speak. But you can get a prosthetic, which is a workaround, and you can do great things. But it's always going to be this thing you have to put on in the morning and take off at night and deal with. And so some people feel really frustrated. It's like, how long do I have to do this? And it's like, well, how long do you want to feel better every day? I don't know.
Yeah. I get the same thing with, eating healthy and exercise, or like, I got to do it again. And I'm like, yeah, forever.
When people balk and they go, it would take so much time for me to write and meditate every day. And I'm like, yeah, and it takes so much time for us to eat food every day, but we want to, because it feels good and we need it.
And it's probably taking more time, you feeling scattered and emotionally dysregulated all the time. That's
exactly.
Yeah.
What is time? Time is the ability to pay attention and get things done. And we've all had the experience where you just can't, you keep starting things and not finishing them, and you can't remember what you were doing, and you're distracted, or you're too bummed out.
Now, and at that part though, that sounds to me a lot like ADHD. How does ADHD, how would it feel or present than complex PTSD?
Well, I'm not a doctor or therapist, so I can't diagnose that. But here's what I read. A lot of ADHD is probably CPTSD, but they just didn't know what CPTSD was because there are overlapping symptoms. And it overlaps also with autism, which it is completely different from, but overlapping symptoms. And it overlaps some with borderline personality disorder, which also could be one of those things that has just been used to diagnose people, especially women who have CPTSD. Who knows? Personally, I think diagnosis is so rough and variable and inconsistent across diagnosticians, especially when it comes to how they treat it, that it's not strictly necessary to worry about that. There is for some mental illnesses, yes. But for CPTSD, it's not even, I think it is in Canada. It's not in the United States. It's not in our manual. It doesn't exist. They know about it and they know about trauma. But the way that people understand trauma is a lot shaped by what agency they work for, what that agenda is, who funds it. And I just find like for health insurance companies or, big providers or public health, they don't have this. They don't know like practical things you can do every day to support yourself. And hopefully that's changing. I think gradually it is. But there's it's been sort of fashionable to be trauma informed, but that could be anything. That could be just being aware that some people are traumatized, but then they go right back in and go, so tell me about your trauma. And that's their toolkit, So different people are different and different providers bring different gifts to it. And so I won't knock any one way or one person, but I think it's really important to understand dysregulation as just sort of like the foundational problem here. And until that's being treated and acknowledged, it's pretty hard to benefit from just about anything, including grad school and
right. And
a nice partner.
I keep coming back to that image of the dysregulated baby and how the baby can be comforted and re-regulated by, for example, its mother. Now, am I right in thinking you are saying we can kind of parent ourselves if we recognize that dysregulation?
I think some people use that metaphor. I don't. Okay. I don't have that. Parenting myself, I think I'm a little bit of a stoic, and I'm just like, I'm not a child anymore. I can't parent myself. I am a parent, and I've parented my kids, but I've never really resonated with that. But I think some people, that is the helpful metaphor for it. And for me, it's naming. I think there are different. I think this is my experience. They talk about that trauma is held in the body. And I think of that as a metaphor too. I think some people think of it literally. This is so speculative and, subjective, right? But I just look at, well, what works? What actually makes people feel better? And what makes me feel better? And it's very dramatic when something does work for me. And so I stick with that and I teach that. And I don't teach what other people teach because that's not the thing that worked for me. So I don't teach about inner child stuff, although that's popular for a lot of people. For me, a lot of the way it manifests is in worried and angry thoughts. So my husband's from England. He calls it chuntering. And when I'm just like leaking my worried, resentful thoughts, I'm walking around going, oh, look at this. Look what the kids left out. We never, ever get this thing. And I'm so sick and tired. Do you hear the leaf blower out there? It's just like going all the time in there. I'm so irritated by everything. I feel victimized by everything. And it has certain patterns in me that I know too well. And those are called emotional flashbacks, where you have this emotional reaction to something not very big, but it's always on a pattern. And mine is, do I have to do everything around here? How?
I think a lot of people would recognize that.
I think a lot of moms feel like that. Yeah. But I think it's an emotional flashback. And how I know that is it's not proportionate to the situation. And it makes me really ineffective at advocating to get some help around the house, because I'm so angry when it's happening. I'm so like frantic and desperate, like a little kid who's not getting helped. So instead of, so what I'm doing is in my method, and that's what I call it now, the crappy childhood fairy healing method. We had to put it on the cover of the book. But I write down the fearful and resentful thoughts. I have fear that I don't get any help around here. Fear my whole life is going to pass me by. And fear all I ever do is try to hold this house together. Fear nobody carries their weight. Fear I just work and work and work and work. And fear everybody takes me for granted. Fear nobody could even get me a cup of tea. I'm resentful at usually the people closest to me, usually my husband, because he's closest to me. He's a good guy. Fear he didn't, I'm resentful at him because fear he didn't get me a cup of tea. Fear he doesn't appreciate me at all. It's things that we all think, but it'll just really like dominate my consciousness. And this is like the substance of my trauma in real time today. It just comes up and it's like driving me and making me unpleasant and unhappy. And it actually can be written on paper. And I'm a spiritual person. I didn't used to be, but this whole thing worked so well. And the person who taught it to me suggested I put God at the top of the paper and say, God, I have fear. Please remove. And she had learned it in AA. That's how they did it. And I was like, I don't like that. And she said, well, you're not going to be alive tomorrow, so you might as well give it a try. Like, oh, true. Okay. So I did that. And the thing was, I healed so quickly that I kind of had a white light spiritual awakening. I was just like, wow, there is a healing power. And it's helping me. So that lit me up. That has propelled me all along. It's been a long time. There have been a lot of ups and downs and times when I was like, this is just BS. What am I doing? This is a cult. This is, just everything. And then I would just come back because it's the only thing that ever worked for me. And when it's working for me, my life is so great. It's just I'm full of potential. My personality works for the world. They don't hate me. I can make a living. I can be married. I can have children and be a good mom. I can drive a car safely. So these are blessings. And so I just kept coming back to it. And that's quitting actually allowed me to understand what it was doing for me. Because when I quit for 2 years, I just went right down the hole again. Couldn't think, couldn't function, my handwriting fell apart even. And so it's so simple. So then I follow it with meditation. It's a writing thing. Very specific. Again, I will give the link to you so you can share it with everybody. Very specific technique so that it's released, not ruminate. You're not ruminating. You're just naming it, getting rid of it, asking for it to be removed if you are so inclined and believe that way. And then resting in a very restful meditation. It doesn't matter if you focus on your breathing or how you sit or anything. Resting and letting your mind come together. And there's research that shows that writing, they call it expressive writing. I don't know if you heard about that recently. Dr. James Pennebaker at University of Texas at Austin. His work was featured on Andrew Huberman's podcast, which was exciting for me because Pennebaker's like one of my heroes and somebody I've learned from closely. But that writing about traumatic things, you can bypass. I happen to know from other researchers, you can bypass that trauma trigger, so it doesn't set off dysregulation. You can write about it. You can even read what you wrote, and it doesn't set off the whole cascade of dysregulation. He didn't look at traumatized people per se, or he may have by now. There's been like 200 peer-reviewed studies. But what he looked at is what happens if you spend. He suggested in his intervention, a person would write 4 days in a row for 15 to 30 minutes about the worst thing that ever happened to them. And they would have these lasting benefits, like their blood composition would change. It was very marked and definite that people had an improvement in their mood and their physiological state, and it lasted for weeks after they had done this exercise for 4 days. For traumatized people, I posit that could be that could tip you over. That's a lot of focusing on the worst thing that ever happened. And so in our technique, we just write about, well, what's up right now? What's agitating you right now? And which is always either about the past or the future. It's not that we avoid the past and the future. In fact, that's always where all these ruminations are about, like fear, I'm going to have to give a speech, and I'm resentful at my mom because when I was 5, my lunchbox smelled like rotten oranges. And it's one of, it did. There was nobody to clean my lunchbox. I used to open it up and everybody would be like, oh,
yeah.
I'd be so ashamed. I was like 5 or whatever. So it just goes on paper, and then rest and meditation. And meditation is also well documented to have positive effects on a dysregulated brain.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned...
So it's very subtle.
And you mentioned exercise, and then you briefly mentioned diet. Can you talk about the role of diet in this?
Yes. So this is something that I think people really don't talk about enough. Why aren't we telling traumatized people, you got to get off the sugar? I mean, you got to try. But sugar is that sugar coma feeling. When you get all dysregulated and you don't have good tools at your disposal, like you got to do something. I used to smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day, and then got off of that, and it was sugar. It could be exciting romance. For some people, it's drugs and alcohol. That never worked for me to feel better. It makes me sad, luckily. So I didn't go down that road. But sugar is very dysregulating. It gives you a little coma that feels like salvation. And I would liken it to isolation, because that's a lot of what traumatized people do, is like just dealing with people is so, and when I say trigger, not like cultural definition of trigger. When I say trigger, I mean a stimulus that causes you to slip into neurological dysregulation. So like somebody yells at you, or you get criticized, or somebody almost runs into you with their car, and the next thing you know, you're back in the dysregulated state. So we just got to learn that it's happening and bring it back as quickly as we can. And it is so much easier if you're not eating sugar. If you're dysregulated, the part of your brain that can reason is kind of shut down, and you're prone to just follow your impulses, or just have crazy thoughts like, oh, I don't need to do this. I'm just going to eat. Like I've done it 1,000 times. I know it like the back of my hand.
Yeah.
So
I know that cycle as well. I wanted to ask you a little bit about triggers, because on your social, you had a quote saying something like, I'm sure I'll get it kind of wrong. Stop trying to make people not trigger you. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah. Well, I guess we've all done it, and we've all had it done to us. But like, can you stop saying that word? Or, can you not talk to other women? And it's okay. Like, it's okay to ask people for what you want from them. But for a lot of people, especially who are living triggered all the time, there's this misunderstanding that the problem is that other people are triggering you, and you would be okay if they would turn into different people. And it's just not practical to believe that, because I have been with people who were just a wreck and like pulled out every stop to try to make them be the person that I imagined they were when I first got together with them. Done it a couple times. And I learned the hard way that you really can't make somebody be the way that you want. You can ask them, but you can't make them. And for those of us who were traumatized as kids, there's almost always an attachment wound there. So we end up impulsively getting into a relationship, often kind of sealing the deal by having sex very early. And then the attachment's there, and you wake up the first day and you're just like, what have I done? I don't even like this person. But you can't leave because that abandonment wound is so strong. It's like, well, if I do that, I'm going to get so depressed, I can't bear it. So I better just work on it. I'll change myself. I'll change them. I'll just make it go. And it's a terrible, exhausting way to live. And so the thing to do is to work on our own triggered reactions and go, wow, I notice when I'm like, here's a trigger for me, street fairs. I still like, they totally overwhelm my senses. I don't like them. Everybody else likes them. They're like, come on, it's fun. You'll like it. And I'm like, no, I just don't like it. I get really dysregulated and feel desperate to get out of there. feel overwhelmed, and then I have to like lay down all day. I just don't like street fairs. And so that's a trigger for me. So should I try to ban street fairs? No, I have to learn to like not go to the street fair, or kind of prepare myself for the street fair and use my tools. I have all kinds of choices in front of me, but I just have to kind of own my trigger. People are going to have street fairs.
Well, that's what I was wondering. I'm like, do you seek out the street fairs then to practice your re-regulation, or do you just avoid them, but you don't try and ban them from the face of the earth?
You can do whatever you want. You can experiment. And I think that the best way to learn is by testing, just doing what you think is the best thing to do. If you're doing my daily practice twice a day, there's this like built-in freedom. Like you can go to the street fair and go, oh, was that wrong? Now I'm a wreck all over again. And you sit down and you're just doing your writing and meditating again. And you can pull back out of it and be like, okay, I guess I understand what the deal is with street fairs. I think I don't like them. So you can just find your way. And there's so many things like that. You can't have hard, fast rules about life, and we change, and some things get easier and some things get harder. And we're kind of figuring it out as we go. So we need a way of life that allows us to make mistakes and come back from it gracefully without too much humiliation. Or if we do make a blunder of things, we can go apologize. It's very freeing. I mean, I used to be paralyzed. And that's the point I was originally getting at, is isolation. Like just dealing with people at all can be so triggering that a lot of us have coped with it. We've treated that trigger by isolating. Just don't hang out with people. It's like my YouTube channel. Whenever I do a video about connecting, there will be some people going, oh yeah, that's me. I want to connect better. I struggle with this. And there'll be like a whole legion of people who go, I hate people. I only deal with cats. It's too much for me. I loved the pandemic. So that's where they are right now. That's necessary at certain phases of trauma. And I just hope for everybody that they start to have choices about that soon. It's okay. Some people can choose to be loners. It's okay. But I think it's better to have a choice about it.
You also said, stop telling yourself the horrible story of your life. And I wonder, how does someone find the balance between learning about, oh, look, this happened to me and these are the consequences in my life today, versus making that a whole big story that they keep repeating to themselves. Oh, I don't like street fairs because this happened to me. Oh, there I go with another relationship because this happened to me. Tell me about finding that balance.
I think that in healing universe, if you're like in a 12-step group or a support group of some kind, that's a lot how you connect with other people, is you go, oh yeah, that happened to me too. And you share your stories. But in the general world, a lot of us find that it's over self-disclosure. It's TMI to go out there and go on a first date and go, so I was sexually abused as a child. And like, that's not the right time to tell somebody something important like that. But it's what we learn is how we connect with people. And I think especially in the age of social media and sort of the elevation of like, the trauma Olympics, I call it, or the victim Olympics, everybody wants something to like give them an excuse to be a flawed human being or something. I really don't mean to put people down, but I think there's more encouragement or even pressure to identify with your trauma now than ever before. And there were other times when it went the other direction. It's like, don't tell anybody. It's only shameful. And that's not true either. There's just kind of a right place for it. And over time, I've had the gift of having my life be a lot more than what happened to me. And so when I teach people, I coach them to like face forward on that one. We know this happened. And like, if you take a coaching program or a course from me, there's always a beginning part of, go ahead, write down what happened, write down the big things. Okay, got it. Now put it over there. Now what's going on right now? Because the stuff that you can work on right now is how you react to stress. And the impulsive choices that you make that you can't help, that maybe you need some guardrails, you need to have a couple of friends who you text before you go on a date, and then text them again at the end of the day and go, there, see, I stuck to my decision that I didn't want to like sleep with somebody on the first date. Just things like that. It's normal stuff, but it needs to be stuff that's like in our lives every day, just people, friends, mentors. And then it doesn't have to be so much. I think there's a lot of things that are necessary sometimes, but they get overrated as fix it, solve everything, like cutting off contact with people who hurt you. such as parents. For some people, that is absolutely necessary. But sometimes I think people get encouraged to do that because it's the only thing that people can see as a way to like make the trouble stop. And there's actually a way that you can become, I call it a Jedi or a ninja. You can be like, you have boundaries, and really good boundaries. Nobody even knows you're doing it. They don't even know, because people who are hurtful, if they see that you're putting up a boundary, they just attack you. So it's just this little subtle art where, yeah, you don't get into tough conversations with mean uncles at Thanksgiving. You don't go to a bar for a date, or you can just make decisions about what are your boundaries, and you don't have to make a big speech about it or condemn other people that they do those things. You just know what you need, and you do it gracefully, and you can actually like go into a tough situation and then scoot along when the whole thing's over later in the day and not get all dysregulated. Because you get into a fight with that mean uncle, you could be out of work for 3 days or more. It could really like lay you out.
And instead it's
just practical.
You just don't start that conversation. I loved those examples of ninja boundaries. Those are really great. So graceful that no one even knows they're happening. It's great. And you mentioned, texting the friend when you come back from the date. I'd love to hear some stories about how other people can support those with CPTSD. Am I going to get it right? Complex post.
Yes, CPTSD.
Thank you. Yes. So how can society as a whole become more aware of and more supportive towards people who are healing from childhood trauma?
It's interesting because on the dark side of trauma is when people are deeply dysregulated and acting out on trauma. That is where we get violent behavior. And so it's not always okay. We don't always have to support everything that traumatized people do. And that can be really hard in couples too, where one person is like, I want to support my spouse because they're, I know it's trauma, but I also see a lot of cases where somebody who's really not being treated well by a spouse, period, is going, I'm sure it's CPTSD and I should just keep putting up with it like a martyr. I'm like, no, you don't have to put up with terrible treatment. And it is the responsibility of traumatized people to do whatever it takes to not abuse other people and to show up for responsibilities and pick up the kids on time. And, these are responsibilities. And so how people can support, here are some very practical things. I just want to get that caveat out of the way. We don't put up with abuse under any circumstances. But here's what you can do. When somebody in your life gets dysregulated, and if you're listening to this, the lights are going off. It's like, that's what she does. That's what he does. And I know that state. It's just over the top, can't be reasoned with. It's not a good time to try to get a resolution. It's not a good time to start peppering with questions or demands or be like, you said you weren't going to do this anymore. Any kind of raising the voice or bang, 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 percussive talking, it's too much. It'll just overwhelm and make it worse. And the person ends up resorting to infantile methods, to try to make it stop, just yelling, screaming, running away, whatever. So what we have in my marriage is we have permission to say, my husband's allowed to say, it seems like you're getting kind of dysregulated. I don't know if that's true. I'm not telling you, But it feels to me like it is. Can we take a break and have this continue this conversation when you feel a little more calm? Because it's hard for me to talk to you when you're this intense. And so we've had enough struggles with my CPTSD that I'm willing to go along with that, even though I think he's wrong. I always think he's wrong when I'm in the middle of it, and in retrospect, I see what he was saying. But when I'm, when I'm dysregulated, my self-awareness is not that great. And so I've just made a promise. If you say you need a break, you get a break. And if I need a break, I need a break. And so a little timeout is really great if you can avoid abandoning talk. So you don't just say, that's it. I'm not going to talk to you right now. When you get like this, I refuse to talk to you. I'm leaving. You don't do that. That's asking for a fight. So instead, you can just say, I'm getting stressed out by the level of intensity here. Can we pause a little bit and come back? I can hear that. And I sometimes it's his turn to get that from me. And certainly so many people in my life are traumatized. So I'm able to sort of carry this lesson. He's the person I've learned it with most deeply, though. I've had a lot of practice to learn what what just pushes us into a bad place and what allows us to get out of the bad place and talk again. And that's so precious. Like everything depends on that. Everything depends on that. I'm so grateful that I found out how to do it. And honestly, you know, a lot of couples counseling that I've ever tried in my life, and this relationship and previous ones, would just dysregulate me so much. And they meant well, and it would have worked on normal people, but it didn't work on me. It just, you know, when they're like, and Anna, how do you feel about that? I would just be like, it would just like set me off, and I can't explain it. And then I look like an unreasonable person, and we can't have that, right? So no. I don't want to be unreasonable, but when my reason is not there, I can't be anything else. And so pausing is what works for me. And while I'm in a pause, I can use my tools. I can use quick neurological changes, go outside and move around, sit down in a chair, stomp my feet, wash my hands in hot water or cold water, or alternate both, or take a shower. But then I always use my writing. That's how I'm just, for 30 years now, that's how I get the bag of cats out of my head and set it over there. And something about that, when you put it on paper, you're not saying that these feelings aren't valid. You're not saying they're fake. Some of them are valid, some are not. Some are trivial, some are important. We're making no judgment. We're just getting it on paper to get some oxygen here so that we can start to have thoughts and decisions again. That's all. So it goes down on paper. And it's a lot of relief comes. My ratio is about 80%. About 80% of my concerns will evaporate by the time I'm done meditating.
Wow.
And 20% will be sitting there kind of crystallized for me. It's like, we got to do something about that tax bill.
Right.
You know?
Which is
whatever
right.
it is.
Probably a much more reasonable approach to that. I mean, I know so many people would definitely want that link to your technique. Do you have anything that you'd like to say to anyone who's listening who just had a really crappy childhood?
Yeah. You know, I have great news. Healing is possible. It really, really is. And whatever you've tried in the past that may have left you feeling hopeless, there's another way. And it can work together with things that are working for you. It can work by itself. A lot of doctors, I don't know, over 100,000 doctors and therapists use these techniques and refer patients to them. It's simple, it's free, it's easy, and it makes you feel better. And it can make you feel better very quickly. If anybody ever tells you, this is going to have to take a long time, it's going to be worse before it gets better, get out of there. Because if you have CPTSD and you're in a crisis, you cannot afford to feel worse. You need to feel better right now. And I insist on that. And so that's what this is. It's a way that you can start to get emotional relief and mental relief from intense stress. And everybody needs that. I have a lot of friends who aren't traumatized who use this from time to time, like an aspirin. Sure. And then I have traumatized friends who use it more like a toothbrush.
Well, everybody gets dysregulated, even those who had wonderful childhoods. Everyone needs re-regulation techniques. Yeah. So I'm sure everybody could benefit from this. Yeah. Anna, I feel like I've got so many more questions. I feel like I could talk to you for so much longer, but I gotta wrap us up. And I appreciate you being on the show so much. This has been amazing.
Yeah, let's talk again sometime.
I love that. Thank you. Wow. I had so much more I wanted to ask Anna, so I might have to have her back on. In the meantime, definitely check out the links in the show notes. She's got a free course on her daily practice of self-regulation and also a quiz that will help you determine if you have any of the symptoms of childhood PTSD. If this episode was helpful or interesting to you, and if you would like to hear more from Anna, definitely let me know so I can set that up. Send me a DM on Instagram, and I will see you next week. Hey dude, thanks for listening. If you like this episode, make sure you're subscribed so you can get the next one. And by the way, if you rate and review this podcast, it really helps me get found by other people who need some goals, grit, and some woo-woo shit. And be sure to connect and DM me at Una Duncan on Instagram and let me know what you thought of the episode. Chat soon.